Welcome to Soul Sessions. We're here with a very special guest, Connie Zweig, Ph.D. She's a retired therapist, writer, climate reality leader, and citizens climate lobbyist, known as the Shadow Expert. She is the co-author of the Meeting the Shadow and Romancing the Shadow, one of my favorite books, and a novel, A Moth to the Flame, The Life of Sufi Poet Rumi. Her award-winning book, The Inner Work of Age, Shifting from Role to Soul, extends her work on the shadow into midlife and beyond, and explores aging as a spiritual practice.
Wow.
Welcome, Dr. Connie.
You're speaking our language.
Yes.
Thank you. And there's another book, so I'm not sure where you took that, but it's an old bio. Sorry, I
Oh,
didn't send one.
that's okay.
I kind of assumed the publicist would do
Is
it.
that the one you sent with the,
Well, the other book is Meeting the Shadow on the Spiritual Path, which
wonderful.
extends shadow work into religion and spirituality.
Oh, wonderful. Well, we'll
Okay.
definitely have to make sure they go in the show notes for everyone to
Thank you.
get that too. Yeah, great.
Thank you, Deborah.
So we talk a lot about the shadow and Jungian topics on our show, but it's always good to just give it a refresher. So the very first question I have is, how would you describe what the shadow is in briefly for someone who's never heard of Jung or his psychology?
So the shadow is the part of us that's outside of the light of awareness. So it's hidden. It's like a dark room in which all of our images and dreams and desires and forbidden actions and wishes are hidden. And shadow work is like the process of developing the images and bringing them back into the light. So anything at all can go into the personal shadow or the personal unconscious, anything at all. So it could be our anger, our sexual fantasies, our secret dreams, our sorrow and grief, whatever it was that was discouraged or forbidden or actively punished by the adults when we were growing up. And so that's why it includes what we might look at as positive traits. That maybe we had a dream of becoming an artist and our parents just said, poo, no, you have to be academic and make a
Right.
living. Or maybe we had an athletic dream to be a professional ball player. No, that's not okay. And so part of when Jung said the essence of the shadow is pure gold, part of it was about uncovering the messages hidden in these traits that are, quote, negative to the ego, but also uncovering these positive traits that we may have buried, that may erupt in midlife or in late life. So anything can be shadow content. And the shadow is the container in which they dwell. And of course, we know that it's not just a little corner of the mind now, right? Because, when he did this 100 years ago, they didn't know the whole mind-body connection. So the shadow's throughout the body. It's in our muscles and nerves, right? It's not only in the mind. And for people who are a little bit more esoteric, it's also in the subtle body. It's in the chakras, right? So the shadow material is influencing us from lots of different directions.
I love it. I love the image of the dark room where you're revealing these images and then, kind of absorbing them.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love also that you do not pathologize the shadow, that it's something very natural to us, to our human experience. How can you help us kind of translate a lot of this work so that the everyday person can use this information in their everyday life?
Well, my two oldest books now have new editions with new writing in them because we wanted to update. There's a resurgence of shadow work now going on.
Amazing. Yeah.
And so we wanted to update them with current issues. So if people are interested in exploring family dynamics, relationships, politics, work, creativity, then they can look at the 65 essays by thought leaders in Meeting the Shadow. It's a collection. And if they're interested more in relationship focus, what's going on in my intimate relationship or my friendships? Why am I getting triggered? Why is there a repeating fight? Then they can look at the method in Romancing the Shadow. That's what that focuses on. So let me talk for a couple minutes about the method, and because that's kind of what your question is.
Sure.
So I realized at a certain point when I was writing Romancing the Shadow that every time a specific shadow figure emerged from the unconscious, whether it was a critic or an addict or a tyrant or a negative parent's voice or a foodie, whatever it was, that particular figure always said the same thing inside our heads. It had the same repeating voice. And same feelings went with that voice. And the same bodily sensations went with the thoughts and feelings. And then I had it because I knew that there were 3 cues that anybody could tune into to detect that shadow figure. So let's say it's the foodie. So the foodie is always going to say, just a little more ice cream, right? And that person is always going to feel the same feelings. Maybe it's sadness, loneliness, maybe it's emptiness. And the body is always going to have the same sensations. Maybe it's tight shoulders or tight throat or queasy belly. And once you get those cues, and it can be any one of those cues, then you know that the foodie is emerging from the shadow, and it's going to get you to act in a certain way, unless you bring awareness to it, and then you have choice. So anybody can do this in any circumstance. I mean, anyone can, you don't have to be a scholar of Jung. You don't have to have a lot of money. It's a human nature that we're kind of built this way, that the shadow develops inevitably in tandem with the ego, the conscious personality.
Right.
So the ego develops as a pleaser with caregiving, and the shadow then develops as, the feelings of resentment or overgiving or shame go into the shadow, right? So everybody develops these traits in tandem. So when you are grown up and you start to notice that one of them is acting out, you're controlling in a relationship, or you're distancing, or you're shut down, or you're, bossy at work, or you're submissive at work. Whatever it is, you can begin to detect a particular shadow figure by those 3 cues.
Yeah.
And then you can name it. So you give it a name, let's say bossy, and you give it an image. Let's say it's a figure going with a pointy finger. You can't see this in my Zoom, right? Pointing a finger, being bossy. So now you have all those different dynamics with which to personify this figure. I use that term from James Hillman, personification. So now, instead of having this kind of massive amorphous unconscious that you don't know what to do with, you have a particular bit of it that you can begin to relate to. What is this bossiness about? You can dialogue with it. You can write to it and from it. You can begin to uncover the messages. Maybe you discover that it's bossy because it feels powerless and helpless, really inside. So it's acting bossy to compensate it. Could be a lot of different things. Could be that your father was bossy and you just internalize that. The point is that now that you know that, and you start to explore the consequences of it, how it's affecting other people, and how they feel about you, and how you feel about yourself. If you're eating ice cream every night and the foodie is in control, how do you feel about yourself, right? Then you have a choice.
That's that choice is really key.
Yes.
Does that imply that before shadow work or before shadow integration, the individual does not have free will?
Oh, you're not going to go philosophical on me about free will. I can't speak in these kind of grandiose terms. What I can say is that, in psychology, we talk about a complex, which is kind of a group of images and feelings and thoughts that are bound together, right? And they form a shadow figure. For most people, when those are unconscious, we don't have free will. I mean, if you think about addiction,
Yeah.
or you think about a repetitive fight in a couple, they want to change and they're unable to because they're in the grips of that shadow figure, right? So for me, it's not about sort of the discussion of higher principles. It's more about how to help people where they live and what they need to actually manage their lives and thrive.
But at a practical level, it does give you a choice that you now have a
Yeah,
choice.
yeah. I mean, when like 40 years ago, and I discovered my first shadow figure, it was the judge. And that happened because on New Year's Eve, I was sitting around with friends and I said to them, "How did you experience me this year?" And the majority of them said, "You're too judgmental."
Oops.
And that changed my life.
Mm-hmm.
It totally reoriented my psychology because then I had a choice. If I understood why I was judgmental and how it was affecting people and how it was affecting how they felt about me and what was hidden inside of that message,
Mm-hmm.
right? I could change and I could have more equality, less superiority trip with people,
Mm-hmm.
right? And open my heart more deeply. So there was choice.
Yeah. And so I love the romancing the shadow. We started off doing lots of relationship coaching. So it was a lot of people were very drawn to your work, recommended your book. Um, when you see, I mean, I guess this question, when a couple meets and they're married and then they don't do any shadow work and then they start doing shadow work, do you feel that if one person does shadow work and the other one doesn't, that, what's the impact on that relationship? Do both people have to do shadow work? Or is it one person can do it and then it changes the dynamic? Or what
I
has
think
been your
that's very
experience?
individual. It's such a good question. It's very individual couples. So
Hmm.
I've seen couples in which one person was in therapy with me and the other one wasn't,
Hmm.
right? And the client learned how to communicate with I statements, how to be accountable for her projections, how to kind of own what was going on with her and tune in to him differently with
Hmm.
less blame, less pathologizing, making wrong, right? And so I'm thinking about a particular couple that was able to do that with one person doing shadow work. I've had other couples that aren't able to do that because the person who's resistant to change, if he or she digs their feet in and says, "I can't change how I communicate. I'm not doing anything wrong. I don't want to grow in this way," then it's really hard,
Hmm.
right? It becomes really challenging. And if you think developmentally, one person is developing to a new stage and the other one isn't.
Yeah.
It becomes really tricky.
Yeah. We've seen some people, like we worked with people that have done our work and then they kind of outgrow their partner.
Right.
And they think, it just doesn't fit anymore.
Yeah.
Who I know who I am like I was attracted on their persona level, and now
Right.
knowing who I am, and this opens up a lot. So yeah.
Yeah. So, I think most marriages are persona marriages
Mm-hmm.
because people don't have the tools to really look more deeply. My husband and I added vows in our wedding where we said, I promise to honor and respect your shadow characters.
Mm.
I promise, right? I promise to include your shadow characters in our communication. We didn't say obey, obviously, but, and that shadow marriage has really helped us through the years, 30 years now, having made that promise.
Yeah.
Because, every relationship gets rough,
Yeah.
Yeah.
has challenges.
Well, Rob and I have been together for 20 years. And
Mhm.
I remember when we would have conflicts, he would be like, is that your shadow or is this my shadow? Like, what is going on? So you can have those deeper conversations and
Yeah.
you don't take things so personally. You're really both willing to work it out together.
Yeah.
What were you going to say? Sorry.
Well, we know Jung talks about projection in the romantic relationship. How does that play out in as couples begin to do shadow work and understand projection? What are the important dynamics that you've seen?
Well, in projection, which is also inevitable and natural, for the way the psyche is made, we unconsciously attribute something that we don't want to see in ourselves to somebody else, right? So we're seeing this on a massive scale in our world right now.
Mm-hmm.
We're seeing it in the wars. We're seeing it from our president. We're seeing it from in every culture in the world right now. There's individual and collective shadow projection going on. And so what that means is most of our root problems, whether it's racism or ageism or sexism or fear of immigrants or fear of the gay population, whatever that is, it's all rooted in shadow projection. And it's kind of mind-blowing when you see that and you start to filter things that way.
Mm-hmm.
So the same thing is going on at home in our little microcosm,
Mm-hmm.
where we're saying, you're like this or you did that. So if we can learn to stop and take a breath for a minute and just ask ourselves, is that true? Or is that, but for a woman, let's say, is that something about my father that I'm putting on him?
Mm-hmm.
Or my fear of my father, or my anger at my father that I'm putting on him? And take a pause and ask yourself, is there a shadow projection here? And he needs to do the same thing. And in a gay couple, they need to do the same thing. What are we imagining about the other person that isn't accurate and that we're not wanting to see in ourselves?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes the target fits, right? It may have some accuracy about the other person, but what is it that we're giving away from our own psyche and shooting it like an arrow onto the other person? And when you start to see through your projections, you start to see how everybody's doing this, right? How this is happening on this massive scale, and it's happening in families, in religions, between religions, in all kinds of groups, social groups. Friends get into conflicts from shadow projection, right? And it usually involves an exaggerated emotional response. Like you walk into a party and you don't know anybody, and you see this woman and you say, oh gosh, she's really seductive. You don't know anything about her. Or this man and you say, oh, he's really aggressive. So you hear yourself say that. You can just take a breath and pause and ask yourself, is this a shadow projection?
Mm-hmm.
And why am I doing that?
Yeah. When you're triggered, right? When you buy into the projection, then you're giving away your power, in essence. That's what you're saying, right?
You're giving away a part of yourself that belongs in your own treasury. Maybe it's your own anger. Maybe it's your own seductiveness. Maybe it's your own depression. Maybe it's your own self-expression, right? In Meeting the Shadow on the Spiritual Path, a lot of that book is about projecting the light.
Mm-hmm.
So people project onto their clergy and onto their gurus. He has so much more compassion than I do. Or she has more enlightenment than I do. So they are really, then it's obvious that they're giving away their power, right? In relationships, people give away their power in lots of different ways. Lots of ways in which they, instead of empowering each other, they disempower each other in order to feel safe. But then they end up feeling small.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things, do you think would we avoiding conflict would be one, like a shadow projection, because you're afraid to like confront the shadow or confront confrontational, especially for women. We're raised, a lot of them, to be the pleaser, and so and then they quietly stuff their feelings, and then that anger builds up, and then it becomes, why did you leave the dishes in the sink or something? And it has nothing to do with the act itself, but kind of shows up in those ways.
Yeah, that's a really common pattern.
Mm-hmm.
I think, both genders can be pleasers and give up their power in order to feel loved and accepted and safe. And then they get quieter, and then they get smaller. And all that charge is going into the shadow. It's
There's
just
energy they can't use. It's
it's
just
energy they can't use. It's not available to them. And it builds up until it erupts. Now, it may erupt in an innocuous comment about the dishes, but it could erupt in rage,
Mm-hmm.
right? It could erupt in abandonment. It could erupt in abuse.
Mm-hmm.
So there's, a spectrum of
Yeah.
shadow eruption, right? So I think it's the pattern that you're pointing out is really important in relationship. And we're not taught how to communicate consciously, creatively, responsively, so that we feel safe to speak up. We
Most of
feel
us, our parents didn't speak to each other that way,
it wasn't modeled for
Yeah,
most
yeah.
people. It wasn't modeled for most people. My parents had a really difficult relationship, but they also put us in therapy from a very young age.
Oh,
So we
wow.
were all trying to learn how to communicate, the four of us. And that was unusual.
That is.
Yeah.
Amazing. Uh, can I ask you in particular how you work with your clients when you're taking them through shadow work? Uh, so let's say, I'm sure you help them understand their projection, let's say. Is that enough to simply uh, give them insight or help them gain insight into their projections?
So I'm retired from clinical practice, retired in 2018 or 19. And most people came to me, the books were sort of the referral service. So people came to me for shadow work, whether they were individuals or couples. But they were a wide range of people, Rob. So if they had, just kind of a neurotic adjustment disorder, which we talk about as, going through a transition or just feeling hurt about something. But then then it's one way of working, right? But then if they have a history of trauma and abuse, it's a different way of working. If they have a personality disorder, I often didn't do shadow work. From my point of view as a depth psychologist, there are some people who aren't ready to open up the unconscious. It's a Pandora's box for people who don't have a consolidated ego. So I would take the time to get to know them a bit
Mm.
and be sure that they didn't have serious trauma and boundary violations, and that they could actually manage the unconscious material that would be coming up if we started shadow work. And then if we decided to do that, I would teach a centering practice. So either belly breathing or meditation or chanting, something that would help them quiet the mind and center, get rooted in themselves, like a refuge to come back to after they meet the shadow.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I feel like shadow work is a spiritual practice, because for me, it always went with a spiritual practice. Many people are not ready to kind of look at their own forbidden material, which is often ugly, repulsive to them. You know, it's tricky.
You have to have kind of a strong sense, like some kind of strength on the conscious level to
Yeah,
like go through and face the difficulties.
yeah. So I would prepare them with centering and then meet the shadow gently. And then I would also look at their typology. You know about that from Jung?
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
So if they were more thinking types, I would have them look at the repeating thought patterns.
Mm.
That's because they would have easier access to that cue to the shadow character. And if they were feeling types, I would have them attune that way. And if they were kinesthetic sensate types, I would have them attune that way.
Mm.
And that was really interesting because I'm not sensate at all. But I would have people who could just zoom right into the body and then they would know the shadow character,
Mm-hmm.
right? But you want to be sure that they have enough integration and balance to be able to do that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, otherwise the defenses will just come down and they'll run away.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, we know Jung kind of framed it in that context of an encounter, right, with the unconscious mind or with a shadow. Um, Besides let's say the breathing or this preparation for that encounter with a shadow, where does it lead the client as they, let's say, as they confront their shadow and acknowledge it, and then I imagine integrate it or accept it? What do you see then as the transformation that it gives them?
Well, I think Jung, we should say, primarily worked with dreams and free association around this material, right? And active imagination, creativity.
Mm-hmm.
So if we look at creativity and shadow work, I used to teach that. I haven't done that for a while. Let's say someone's a procrastinator, they can't finish a project or they can't start a project, either one. So if they begin to romance the procrastinator shadow and get what's going on at a deeper level, are they afraid of failure? Are they afraid of being seen? Are they afraid of not being seen? Are they ashamed of what they're doing? You know, what is going on? Then often what happens is that shadow material loosens its grip. And then they start to identify, okay, I'm hearing that voice, just do it tomorrow. That's the procrastinator. I'm not going to do it tomorrow. I'm going to do a little bit right now. I'm going to make a different choice. I'm going to spend 1 hour and start the project and see what happens to the procrastinator. You see what I mean? So they're not in the grip of that shadow because they've kind of identified it and explored it a little bit. Maybe they've traced back in their childhood where it came from, because that's another dimension of this. Where does the shadow originate? And it often originates out of a valid need. So if somebody was constantly criticized for their schoolwork in elementary and middle school, oh, that's terrible, bad, ugly. You'll never be an artist. You'll never be a mathematician, whatever it is. What? Of course, they're going to have a procrastinator, right?
All right.
So that fear that's built into that shadow figure can begin to lessen when we understand its origins. It actually defended him, that little boy, from being
Mhm.
criticized
Mhm.
or shamed.
There's
Right?
the protector.
The protector. Everyone, every shadow is a saboteur that was originally a protector. Every one of
Mhm.
them protected us from something.
Mhm.
So then here he is, he's 35 years old and he wants to do an architectural drawing, but he can't start. So now he begins to understand why he can't start. And he has this conscious choice and he starts just for a little bit. He doesn't have to show it to anyone. He just takes that first step. Okay, so you see the
Mhm.
shift?
Right.
Or like me with the judge, it could be an internal character that's not about action, but it's about a relational style.
Mhm.
Or it could be that foodie we were talking about. When she understands she's eating the ice cream because her boyfriend's not calling her and she's really
Mhm.
disappointed and she can't speak up
Mhm.
because then she could be rejected. So she can't risk the rejection. So she eats and she stuffs her feelings. Guess what? Just like her mother did,
Mhm.
right? With the father, couldn't speak up, used food to stuff it down. So when you start to see all that and you see the consequences it's having on you, you know, she's gained 10 pounds. She doesn't know if she's in the relationship or not. So I would help her to be able to express this to her boyfriend.
Mhm.
See, it's not the presenting problem about eating ice cream, right? So she expresses it to the boyfriend. The boyfriend says, you know what? I'm not in this. I'm not really interested. So now she knows. So she has to mourn the relationship, and it takes a while. But guess what? She doesn't need to eat the stuff, those feelings anymore.
Mhm.
And she's learned that she can survive speaking up.
And so where do emotions play in? And do you do any kind of emotional work with the, where did you when you were like when
Well,
people have emotions, like how would you work with them in the process?
well, each person is different.
Mm-hmm.
Again, you know, each person is, you know, someone who's a feeling type without much thinking developed is often flooded by emotions,
Mm.
right? That would be different from someone who's more analytical and strategic and is disconnected from emotions,
Mm, that's true.
right? So, um,
And then it depends on the level of mental ability they have, like if they're have traumas or, personality
yeah,
would
and it
be,
depends on my relationship with them.
yeah.
What kind of transference do they have with me? You know,
Mm,
am I a mother to them? So
mhm,
then I can work with that quality in the transference.
mm,
They need remothering.
mhm,
Or, you know, if what they really need is just to be seen and heard,
mm,
which is what a lot of people need. I think that, you know, we call it narcissistic injury. I mean, that injury is just epidemic in our culture.
mhm,
And therapy, if people are trained to do therapy to recognize that, it can just be about validating the feelings.
mhm,
Some people have never had that experience that their
mhm,
feelings are validated,
mhm,
you know? They're heard, they're accepted, they're validated, and that's enough. And then the feelings start mellowing out because they don't have so much charge behind them.
mhm. Yeah, that makes sense.
Amazing. You've written about spiritual bypassing in very in-depth, in an in-depth way. What are the signs that we can look out for when we ourselves uh, might be drifting into spiritual bypassing?
Um, well, I wrote about that at length in Meeting the Shadow on the Spiritual Path out of my own experience. because I started transcendental meditation at age 19 before I knew anything about anything, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, I bought into it. I bought into meditation will solve all my problems, but not only that, it'll solve the world's problems. And I thought I could bypass emotional development, cognitive development, moral development, because once I was enlightened, I wouldn't act immorally. I mean, I just bought into the whole sort of spiritual framework that that's the solution to every problem. And, you know, it turns out that we can't bypass these other kinds of development with meditation alone, or any kind of spiritual practice, whatever it is, prayer, chanting, whatever it is, devotion to a teacher. They're all so valuable, but they're not panaceas. And so, and I would, you know, I'd have people come to me who were with spiritual teachers who were acting out their shadows. I mean, I remember this woman who came, she said, he makes all the women get naked and he makes us take drugs when we don't want to. I mean, it was like this story that was, you know,
Yeah.
and she was just caught. And it didn't start out that way. It started kind of open and then it got kind of more and more cult-like, you know. And I think that that's happening in a lot of churches, and it's happening in synagogues, and it's happening in Eastern oriented spiritual traditions. And part of it is because people buy into spiritual bypass and they think all that really matters is waking up. And if I just ignore all this other stuff and I stay with the program, then I'll wake up and all of this will stop, or it'll change, or it won't matter, right? So when I went through that with the TM movement, and it started out very open and beautiful, and it got more and more rigid, and then there was a lot of hypocrisy and people were lying. So after about 10 years, I left. And I ended up writing my PhD dissertation about this. It was called The Holy Longing, which is the name of a poem by Goethe that I really love. And I felt that that longing, that spiritual yearning for God or the divine or the beloved, whatever we call it, for union, for the one, had been running my life. And that it was, you know, driving many people to tolerate abusive situations with teachers. And so that later led to that book about this. And I really felt like depth psychology could help people understand the levels of projection, you know, the personal projection, the archetypal projection, but also the other way, why these teachers were acting out their shadows. So I just I dug into that for a number of years. I just felt compelled to understand it out of my own experience of spiritual bypassing and recovery.
What comes to mind, and I'm sure you've seen this, where people who want to be spiritual, and it's a challenge to face the shadow because there's those unsavory parts of ourselves, and we don't want to identify with them because we're a spiritual person.
Right.
We're not angry, we're not selfish, we're
Right.
not rude, and sexuality, all those things that are in the
Right.
shadow.
Right. I call it a spiritual superego.
Ah.
Yeah, because it's telling us how to be. And that self-image that that superego is creating a lot of shadow content at the same time, right? Don't feel your sexuality. Don't do this. Don't do that. Don't eat that. Don't talk that way, whatever it is. Don't feel that feeling, right? And a lot of these communities have a lot of proscription, a lot of prohibition against certain behaviors. And, you know, we also see in celibate communities, both in the East and the West, we see, priests and gurus acting out around sex.
Yeah.
We see it around money, we see it around power.
Mm-hmm.
And so people can't escape their shadows.
Mm.
They can choose not to act them out with consciousness, with awareness. But, Rob, you asked about insight. For many people, insight is not enough
Mm-hmm.
to change behavior. So some people who are acting out, like, look at all the therapists who violate their ethical codes.
Mm-hmm.
They have insight. They know about the ethical codes and why they were written, and they don't stop themselves. So insight is not enough. Often, for some people it is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But for other people, like these clergy we're talking about, it's not enough to change behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And we've seen in the Catholic Church scandals,
I
and the
know.
childhood sexual abuse stuff. It goes on and on. It's been decades now.
Yeah.
It's still going on.
Is that, would you say, a collective shadow of the organization? Because
Well, at this point, it certainly is.
yeah, it appeared to be worldwide. It
Yeah,
wasn't
it's
just.
worldwide. It's in the institution. It's like systemic.
Mm-hmm.
And it's exactly what Deborah just said. The system can't look at the blind spot. It can't see something so terrible about itself and do something about it. I
Mm-hmm.
thought Pope Francis was going to do something about it, and he may have tried, but this has become institutionalized in the Catholic Church in a way that it's an incredible example of the eruption of shadow and the inability to process it and then change behavior, even
Well,
if they
it's
change policy.
interesting when you say this, the Conclave, that movie. I'm
Yeah.
sure you've seen it. And I don't know if you'll say the end, but the end, it really turned out to be the shadow of the church, that,
Oh, the end was kind of mind-blowing.
yeah. So
Yeah.
it's like everything they pushed away
Yeah.
becoming what they
Yeah.
created. And I think that's one of the things why people need to do the shadow, because it's going to dictate to you versus you it being in control.
Yeah. And the Catholic Church isn't the only one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It happened in Buddhism. It's happened in
Yeah.
all these cults. You
Yeah.
watch a documentary on Netflix, and there's many of them
Yeah.
examples.
That's
And
right.
these people start out with such a good intention. And then I think the power, like, I don't know, the power brings out, suppresses, like almost like they don't want to look at what they're really doing, and it blinds them.
Some of it is the power. There was a young man, a Tibetan monk, who was supposed to be the incarnation of Kalu Rinpoche, this renowned Tibetan monk, Lama. And I saw him on YouTube, and he said, many of the monks in Tibet and Nepal are sexually molested in the monasteries.
Wow.
So if you look at it that way,
Because we're all human beings.
it's kind of like sexual abuse in families.
Mm-hmm.
It's being passed on. And if it isn't really looked at straight in the eye and examined and healed so that there's a recovery process, then it will continue to be intergenerational shadow material, and it's just tragic. It's really tragic.
So this gives me a kind of a view of society, as we create all these institutions, essentially run by people that are very much possessed by their egos and their personas, uh, that are totally very much in danger, right, of playing out their shadows. And so, what are we just kind of we're we're caught up in this dynamic, and very few people get to do shadow work, therefore really are genuine, let's say, in their way of being, and the rest or most of society is simply playing out this fear of their shadow, or actively repressing their shadow, and therefore they can't reach that state of genuine expression of
You
themselves.
know, unlike most Jungians, I'm also developmentalist. I really think developmentally too, and archetypally. Um, and I really like Ken Wilber's maps of stages of development.
Mm-hmm.
And so I really look at the human population in stages. And right now there's a very primitive stage that's taken over our country, right? I mean, Trump is the embodiment of it, but all the people around him and all the Republican Congress and all, they're all going along.
Yeah.
They're all not looking at the shadow,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that to me is a particular level of development or stage of awareness, whatever we call it, in humanity. And it's a pretty primitive stage because it's rooted in shadow projection
Mm-hmm.
and anger and hatred and control and power and money, right? So there are people on the planet who are in later stages of development. They tend not to go into politics, but there are lots of people, my husband is one of them, who have attained very advanced stages of awareness and have enough grounding in being human. You know, they didn't float away. If they're really grounded in being human as well, then they're not going to act out their shadow material so much. So I think, and you know, I don't know if you've ever looked at Buddha at the gas pump. It's a great podcast about ordinary people who are having these spiritual awakenings. And there are lots of them now. So there's this advanced part of humanity and this primitive part of humanity. And most, I would say the majority is in between in a rational, scientific stage of awareness. That's where most people live in Western culture. And Europe, you know, in post-industrial European rationality. So that's kind of how I look at it. I really work on not judging people who are in earlier stages because they can't help it.
Mm-hmm.
And they can't see out of that box.
Mm-hmm.
You can't talk to Trump about shadow projection. I mean, it doesn't, you know.
Yeah.
So it's tragic to me. I mean, it's shocking. I feel a lot of grief. I think in some ways it's the reaction to Obama
Mm-hmm.
as well as to Biden. But what's happening now with the climate, you know, it's just not even only financial and political. I mean, the climate is now at risk.
Yeah, I see
So,
that you're really the climate reality leader.
well, I
And
was trained by Al Gore years ago,
oh wow.
long time ago when he was still doing the trainings. And then I went and lobbied Congress, and that was just useless.
Mm.
So, you know, he's reversed everything now that's been done.
I
And
know, actively and
It's like
without,
destructive.
yeah, without shame. I mean,
yeah,
the level of corruption is just amazing.
yeah, he has no shame. Yeah.
And so
So,
we can do our part by doing our own work and being a part of the enlightened, going up the levels of developing ourselves and
yeah,
then helping others.
partly through our personal work,
Mm-hmm.
you know, our psychological, emotional, cognitive, moral development, focusing on moral development, and also partly through our contributions to the collective, like what you guys are doing,
Mm-hmm.
educating people, training people, um, you know, speaking, writing, doing activism. In the inner work of age, I have a whole chapter on activism and how to participate consciously because, you know, it's not like doing activism when we were in our 20s. For
Mm-hmm.
those of us in our 70s, it's just it's such a different moment, you know. So there are different styles for introverts and extroverts, for people who have different passions.
Mm-hmm.
There are different ways of contributing, but there's so many ways,
Mm-hmm.
I think, of having a voice and really being creative about it.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it's just grandparenting, there's many ways, right? Relating to the next generations. And part of why I'm so excited that Meeting the Shadow and Romancing the Shadow are getting all this new material and new covers is because it's reaching new generations,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
right? So that's exciting to me and hopeful to me, even though, it's not massive numbers of people. It's still happening, and that means humanity continues to evolve.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
I have a couple of questions that I want to
Sure.
get in, but
Go ahead.
just brief one, and feel free to pass on them if you don't think they're relative. There's a growing interest in psychedelic plants and plant medicine. Your thoughts on that? Also, your thoughts on AI, if any, and then kind of your personal thinking on what is the spiritual future for humanity?
Just
Oh
some
my
light
God.
questions.
Oh my God. You like these big ideas, Rob. I have a number of colleagues who are doing psychedelic psychotherapy now who are raving about how it's helping people in different ways. I was in Berkeley in the late 60s. So for me, it feels like it's cycling back,
Mm-hmm.
but it's
Timothy Leary.
being done differently in a more therapeutic setting now. So, and again, this is so individual. I think there's good timing for some people. There needs to be integration work rather than doing it socially.
Mm-hmm.
That's really important from my point of view. And, is the person's psyche ready? It's like shadow work. It's going to
Mm-hmm.
blow up unconscious material. Is the person ready for that? Is it the right time, the right stage? So AI, no comment. And, what's the spiritual future? I don't know. Because I started meditating more than 50 years ago, and I've learned many, many practices, it's been really an integral part of my life, as much as psychology has. They've both been very formative to me. And, and I married a guy who also lives there, psychological and spiritual development. And he's really attained a high stage of awareness. So I get to see it up close every day. We do a podcast. It's called Dr. Neil's Spiritual Awakening to Non-Duality.
Wow. Awesome.
And it's on all the platforms. It's on Apple and Spotify and everywhere. So if people are interested in spiritual awakening, you can check that out. It's kind of, he and I are moving into retirement and other things now, and that's where we're going to focus, is on the podcast. So people can be in touch with us there.
It's our jam, non-dual philosophy.
Oh, it is?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah. Very, very.
great. What
Yeah.
practices do you do?
We primarily Jungian psychology, but do we apply the principles of non-duality?
Oh, okay. That's exciting.
Yeah.
Well, you might enjoy. I'm interviewing Neil and asking him questions, and we have this conversation. It's very personal and
Yeah.
very fun to see, because he's living in non-duality, and yet he's highly functioning in duality,
Mm.
Right.
and so we were able to talk about attention and states and how it works for him and all that. So for people who are interested in that, can join us.
Yeah. We'll
Check it
definitely
out.
put his information in the show notes as well.
Okay, great. Okay,
Yeah.
great. And in terms of, general humanity, I don't know any more than you do about that. I think, you know, the polarization that we're seeing now is really scary. And maybe it's a regression in
Mm.
service of the ego, you know?
Mhm.
Maybe it's here to stay. I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, I hope that it's just the dark night before the dawn.
Mhm.
And
Yeah,
that there's something new. It's like some kind of rebirth is going to happen.
yeah, yeah. The breakdown before the breakthrough.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
So, well, it's just been such a pleasure to spend this time with you. So
yeah.
honored.
Thank you so
Just been a
much.
fan since I read your book years and years ago, and to have you on the show, it's been great. And I'm sure our audience is going to eat all this up. Love it.
Thank you so
Amazing
much.
body of work.
Mhm.
Thank you so much for doing your work. We really
Mhm.
appreciate it.
Yeah,
Thank you for doing yours too.
thank you. And yeah, best of luck in your retirement, doing your podcast and having fun.
Yes, lots of fun
Having
stuff.
and all this legacy you have with the books and that you've done all these years. It's just amazing.
Yeah, thank you, Deborah. I feel good about it.
Great. Well, thank you again, Connie. It was so good to see Dr. Connie. Good to see you. And hopefully
Take
we'll have
care
you
of
on the show
yourself.
again soon.
Take care of yourselves.
You
You
too.
too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.